So I'm trying to do kind of a daily. I train all day, every day. I'm on my 10th, going into my 11th day of carnivore. So I'm really going deep into the keto, into that, what I call the acetone stage to simplify, right? Where I'm giving off some bad breath. And, I was thinking about, I study so many different things. And it used to be such a dramatic shift where I'd go into the gym or I'd be working out and I'd try to focus in on the practicum of my training, and then on in the back of my mind I'm kind of keep quiet or contemplate something that seemed like a completely different venue or state of mind, right? Uh, from the arcane to the esoteric to everything in between, politics, socio political, economic, driving forces, getting into, the ninth circle that we talk about, Project Gladio or Operation Gladio, if you will, all the way into the Philadelphia experiment, Project Paperclip, Montauk Island, um, Mount Shasta, the deep caverns under Death Valley, the caverns that supposedly connect to the Grand Canyon, the giants, Shalago. Um, you could go on from there, right? So when we get into this whole thing, there's very little separation or disparate division between all of these subjects. You begin to see glimmers of high science and even metabolic sciences, right, in philosophers from hundreds of years ago, right? You can see that they understand a system. You can see the ontology and the epistemology, right? You can see from this doxastic point of view, you know, this multifarious structure that is understood by those who have either been graced with the ability, that is, given the tools to be able to study, to get out the compass in the square, to use the mind, right? But it really does come down to the world as representation and idea, right? And that's who we really are, also. Is that when it comes down to it, what are we fighting for? What are we railing against? Um, the only thing that contends to have a value is an idea of the self, in contrast to the idea of someone else or something else that is either placed in an antithetical, caustic position, right, where you're railing against the machine in order to just be yourself. But when you break down the self that you're trying to protect, when you're alone, when you're really honest with yourself, you begin to realize there is no self and that you're just sort of protecting an ideology that doesn't really exist, right? So we get into the world of as representation and the self as an idea, right? And we're given the base constituents to build up a self. In other words, it's formalized, it's out in front of you. The objects to view and the things that we call experience are placed out in front of you, and you don't have a huge amount of choice. You accept all the physics around you that are influencing you, and this very much geometrically shapes the self. But when you remove all those restrictions, all those constants, who are you really, right? So it gets into a very dynamic aspect of force and how to utilize force. And when you really break things down to the basic constituent, I know I drum along with the same old thing all the time, but it is pure principles, right? And the biggest perplexing question when we've gotten down to this reduction, right, and we're looking at the integer, and we're focused on what you might consider the monad, where somebody like John D or Kelly were just like looking at this and faced with this, and they looked at their world and they saw the darkness of how people came into power. This, how people at the top were able to do whatever they wanted, and they were still fascinated with these occult rituals, right? And that they had at their disposal not only the ability to go through these human sacrifices and to use people like objects or items at their discretion, but it seemed like as if they were dismissed from any sort of karmic agency, right? But still, they were playing a role, right? And it's very interesting how this leads into 007, this John D. This leads into cipher codes, this leads into mathematics and esoteric math, and really what we're faced with today when you look at Konrad Zuse and Alan Turing, right, from the late 1930s to this wasn't even 100 years ago. The things that um, Rudolf Steiner discusses are extremely relevant today. And oftentimes, when I'm listening to Rudolf Steiner audio press, he'll say, "Oh, this was what I was listening to the other day, which was like from sunspots to strawberries." Right? It was basically about this transition of matter and forms, right? And to really see this plasma around us, what we would do with it, what we do with it, how we began, what that midpoint through sort of midlife, right? How we transitioned through those states, and inevitably how things transitioned toward our life end, which is very hard to describe, right? For some people, the entirety of a lifetime is so fast and so fleeting and so ephemeral, while for others, I'm looking at David Attenborough, and he's still doing the same type of voiceovers and even doing camera scenes where I guess he's done a deal with Disney, which is what my son told me, right? So that's why you're seeing his namesake out there so often now, I suppose. And he's doing this whole thing on Earth, and it's just amazing. But it's a call to really say, look, whether you want to call it global warming or if it's just a cyclical aspect that seems to happen through this algorithm, there is an undeniable shift or change. If you want to look into it more esoterically or electromagnetically and say that there's a pole shift, right, or a polar shift. If you want to look at it zodiacally or calendrically, the math is there, the philosophy is there, but what we're faced with is a false recreation in recreation of physics, right? The constraints of physics and the things that we hold dear are beginning to break apart, right? And this challenges thermodynamics. It challenges the very basis of how we can contend the machine aspect of why would we build anything if the physics would change and could change any time? Or getting into Rudolf Steiner, if something that's seemingly solid in a solid state now could transition almost like hydrogen, right? Into just, say that you were able to live and it would be of very little influence to you if it fluctuated 300 or 400 degrees, right? And suddenly, you're at absolute zero, right? Or you're able to withstand the highest Kelvin heat to where you've reached this state of absolute hot, right? So when you get into plasma and you get into the conditional aspects of an idea, we need to be able to have another reference. And this is why principles are so important, right? Is that when you get into purity and you get into the states of expression, you might see the same type of systematic behavior occur on a micro scalable level, or with this, when we think that we're watching images from the sun, but we're really watching radiation, right? And when you see these behaviors of these solar flares and these sunspots, there's a behavior, there's a communication, right? There's an intelligence, there's a consciousness, right? You get into the fact, well, that doesn't have a brain, and it's like, do you really think that your brain and your nervous system is where all this is taking place, right? Even in the master key system with written by Charles F. Haanel, a very high level Mason, you know, they contend that where the self resides, if you could call it, you know, any area, proximal area in our physical condition, associated with the self at all, right? A center would be the ganglionic mass behind the solar plexus, right? And you're really looking at then um, not just your nervous system, but you have the pons in your brainstem that's innervated through your vagus nerve center, right? And then it leads to very, you know, your your olfactory and a lot of the limbic system responses, the amygdala, the caudate patanum, the neocortex, right? Um, all of these areas, right, are either working antithetically to one another or balancing. One is balancing each other out when you're looking at right brain, left brain type of behavior. What you begin to see is that X really does represent where you have the left side of the face feeding into a sort of cognitive innervation with the right hand, right? And the same holds true with like the right eye and what you're perceiving, right? There seems to be a transition over to your left, right? So there's always this balancing, this transition, and this treatise that has to take place in order to get to what? The center, right? To get this center balance. So when I'm training, I'm always focusing on the core first, right? And eventually into the powerhouse with the hips. But that whole region right there, right? And then the sits muscles and all this, right? This whole region there is where that true power emanates from. It's the ability to stand, withstand, to stand under, to understand, right? And to be in this contractual state that is really implied by aromatic amino acids, light, and how bioluminescence and our ability to be able to digest and ingest and to take in all these forms of ultraviolet, infrared, near infrared, you know, this light spectrum, and to be able to transition through what we would consider Plutchik's wheel that could also be identified through another perspective as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have these definite color coding transitions, right? They're not just haphazardly chosen, right? And a transmutation or a transference of energy in the form of things that we can't see, but they are definitely forms of matter, which is why I say things, right? Are codified through a number system, almost like a song, you know, that transitions between prosaic and non-prosaic meaning and interpretations, right? And that the harmonics are really the thing that we need to be looking at, right? So I'm finding that more people are turning toward love, right? And I think that without faith, there can be no love, and without purity, neither can exist. And then it leads into hope. You cannot contend that there could be any hope, and it really is this sort of faked Pangloss hope if you don't have faith, love, right, prior to. And then it gets into other principles that I go through in EPL, which is like it begins with purity every time, right? And it goes into faith, love, hope, mercy, right? To show others mercy. Because now that you've loved someone and been loved and had that exchange, mercy, it comes naturally to you. But then you have to be able to show prudence through other applications, right? So it goes into faith, purity, faith, love, hope, mercy, compassion, right? Passion, trust, duty, honor, union, grace. And then I was getting into this is you get into temperance and care, right? Which are very neutral perspectives, because you could use these if you were to do the antithetical, because there's a backside to this, right? And these really are, along with the main central principles, and I won't even say tenets, where you always begin with purity, right? Just like the zero in the Phi or Fibonacci sequence, you don't necessarily count that. It's always there. It's always present. You're traveling outside of that. You're trying to claim an integer outside in an existential world that just doesn't really exist, where these plasma states are an idea that are contended upon that have to be solidified through deeds and acts. But there is a deed and an act being done to us that is causal, right, through these physics that are heavily affecting and impacting our ability to be able to go through and travel through, right, this principle oriented deed based protocol, right? So there's a real defunct error coding signal happening here, right? And I think many people are beginning to wake up to this. Like, this doesn't make sense, right? So it gets back into the main central principles, right? And again, we won't call them tenets, but it gets into purity, sacrifice, expression, and then it gets into wisdom, right? Community, and then finally it goes into production and ego, right? And it goes back into the pure truth. And when we go through this mantra over and over again, what we come up with is we come up with these 21 principles. And of course, there's a backside to this sort of Merkaba, right? That, so we have these 42 in the art of war. We are forced, just like, if you were to, in a very crude way, think, because it's popular and everyone can associate with it, right? And you could use the Sang Soo a little bit more, the art of war a little more so. But to look at the Sith and the Jedi and the Sith, right? This war between them, and to see that they're tapping into the same force, they're using the same protocol, they use the same training techniques, right? But one is driven by principle and one is driven by anti-principle. And it really depends on which side you stand on that states whether or not you're going to call something anti-principle. Anything that is juxtaposed to you, antithetical to you, is considered anti-principle, right? So, when you go into this art of war, particularly Mindcraft or spiritual war, which is extremely real and people are waking up to this, right? Our thoughts manifest, and particularly when they are developed and when we have a methodology based around it and when there's energy around it, there's power, right? And, we are having to go into areas where the only way to combat these aggressors are to understand them very well, right? So to understand the antithetical or the opposite position. So again, these are just ideas that are manifest from purity and impurity, right? To either protect purity or to sacrifice purity. And so on this world stage, that's really what everything can be broken down into. And when you want to get into a bullshit idea of an egalitarian democratic idea concept of the self, a conceptualization of the self, all you're really looking at is you're giving leave not only to yourself or the projected self or the falsified self, the pseudo self, or the pseudo self that others contend that they are. All this bullshit love bombing and fake ass behavior in order to get things, without having to work so hard. People are flushing that down the toilet. They want to see whether or not people understand these principles, and even more so, most people are designing their own litmus tests, right? Their own reliability tests to be able to determine, and it's becoming a very difficult thing. And that really is the idea behind EPL. It's to be able to distinguish whether or not somebody is going through a very dark protocol, trying to sacrifice the purity in you, in the people you love, in your family, in your community. And once you see that people are really intentionally sabotaging the purity, which all principles begin with, you have to make a choice. And there's going to be a lot of these choices that seem extremely dogmatic from the perspective of people who are pretending and hiding from the fact that to develop the self, to know thyself, is to really know the one self, and the one self is, like, we get back to this place where we want to remove ourselves from a god or a godhead or a pure state or a pure center, but then we crave it and need it, and it is so fundamental to existence itself. All right, we'll talk to you later.